Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're exploring a source that offers a perspective on faith and community that you might find quite challenging, or at least very different.
It's an excerpt from a biblical studies lecture, I believe.
Yeah.
Called Contract Community Formation Through People.
Exactly. And it moves beyond some, common understandings of faith.
Right.
The ones focusing mostly on belief in the afterlife.
Right. Instead, it really zeroes in on forming a specific kind of community. And crucially, it talks about restoring a broken relationship with God through what it calls a covenant.
Yeah, and what immediately struck me is how central, difficult, lived experiences are to this whole idea.
Definitely doesn't shy away from that. It really digs into what it means for a community to be, fundamentally shaped by suffering.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack this viewpoint, explore how these difficult experiences are presented as foundational, understand this idea of a covenant relationship that's defined by action, and see what this source suggests it means to be a community forged in, shared struggle.
Sounds good. Let's jump into it.
Okay. So, right off the bat, the source takes on the idea that salvation is primarily about, say, belief in Jesus and the cross. It suggests that might be, an incomplete picture.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It doesn't see salvation just as, something that happens after you die. Instead, it argues salvation is about returning to a state where you actively uphold the covenant law.
Covenant law, meaning?
Well, it defines that not just as abstract rules, but as the sort of practical terms for fixing that broken relationship with God. It's about bringing that relationship back into a state of rightness, actively.
That is a significant shift in emphasis. Where does the source pull that from?
It points to a specific moment in the Gospels. Remember when someone asked Jesus about eternal life?
Vaguely, yes.
His direct answer is to tell them to keep the commandments, specifically referencing the 10 Commandments. The source sees that interaction as absolutely crucial.
Suggesting that focusing only on belief, detached from action, might miss something core.
Exactly. Missing a core part of the original message about what salvation actually entails, according to this perspective.
So, keeping the terms of this relationship agreement, this covenant law that's presented as essential.
Precisely. The source even kind of pushes back on how we might typically read someone like Paul, whose letters are often seen as putting faith above works. But the core argument keeps hammering home is that salvation in this framework is fundamentally about restoring that practical, lived-out covenant relationship.
Restoring the relationship through action.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving to the historical side. This source puts tremendous weight on the early experiences of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, especially their long periods as sojourners, constantly moving, never really settled. Why is that rootless experience seen as so important here?
Well, if we follow the source's argument, it suggests God deliberately kept them in that vulnerable, unsettled state.
Deliberately, why?
The purpose, it suggests, was for them to intensely, fundamentally feel the suffering of society's most vulnerable people back then, the sojourner, the outsider, and later the slave.
To experience it to the bone, as the source kind of puts it.
Yes, exactly. To deeply understand the plight of those in misery. The driving idea here, according to the source, is that to genuinely solve problems in the world, you first have to step into the heart of the problem itself. It presents this as a fundamental pattern of how God operates, always starting from the lowest, most marginalized place.
That connects perhaps to the idea of Jesus being born in a stable. Is that connection made?
Absolutely. The source sees the birth of Jesus in a humble manger as following that identical pattern, entering directly into the lowest circumstances, sharing that experience from the ground up.
Okay, yeah. That connection makes a lot of sense within this framework. Right. So if the sojourning experience was vital, the source then moves to the next big historical chunk, the 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And, this is tough, it argues this wasn't punishment for past mistakes, but somehow necessary. That's hard to grapple with.
Right. And here's where the source presents a particularly challenging point, isn't it? It argues that the immense suffering of those 400 years was absolutely essential for forming the community's fundamental identity.
Not punishment, but a crucible.
Exactly. A crucible.
Essential. How does it frame that necessity? What makes it essential in this view?
It introduces this really potent concept it calls Hebrewism, defining it quite provocatively as a culture of slavery.
Wow. Okay.
But it's careful to explain this isn't about glorifying oppression. Not at all.
Right.
Rather, it's saying that centuries of shared suffering The collective memory of that misery, the dependence, the deep longing for freedom, understanding what it feels like to be oppressed, that forged a unique cultural foundation.
So the shared experience of suffering, that's what created the community's core identity. Is that the argument?
That's the argument, yes. A culture isn't instant, right? It's built over time through shared experience. This source contends that 400 years of profound suffering was the necessary period to create that deep collective memory, to shape their fundamental values.
So in its view, the suffering was the forge, creating the community's DNA.
Suffering created the community's DNA. That's a powerful way to put it. And yeah, that captures the source's perspective.
Okay, so after this intense suffering, then liberation in the Exodus, they arrive at Mount Sinai. They make a covenant. What's the significance there?
Well, the source sees the Sinai covenant as the culmination of that Hebrewism formed in suffering. And it's the definitive starting point for their new life, their mission.
And the core of that covenant?
The absolute core, as interpreted here, was a command. Do not forget the suffering you experienced as sojourners and slaves.
Do not forget the suffering. And then what? What follows that command?
Right. And the command that immediately followed was essentially, now that you're entering the promised land, Canaan, you must live your lives by actively solving the problems of others who suffer, just like you did.
So their own history of suffering was meant to be the engine for their future actions, actively helping others.
Exactly. And God's promise to always be with them, the whole Emmanuel concept is tied directly to this mission. The source interprets this to mean the community of Israel was called to live in such a way that they would demonstrate God's method of problem solving to the world.
A demonstrating mission.
Yes, that's the term it uses, a demonstrating mission.
And this understanding, the source suggests, explains why they were sent specifically to Canaan, a place described as difficult, conflicted, already inhabited.
Precisely. The argument is they were sent into the hardest, most complex reality specifically to live out this model, engaging directly with real-world problems and working alongside God to solve them.
And this, the source calls the Hebrew approach.
That's right. The Hebrew approach centered on problem solving within the messiness of reality.
Okay, the Hebrew approach. How is that contrasted? Does it offer an alternative?
It draws a really strong contrast with what it terms the Hellenistic approach, which it characterizes as prioritizing theoretical knowledge, the pursuit of abstract truth, but from a distance.
Like philosophy from an armchair, maybe.
Right.
Detached from immediate suffering.
That's kind of the implication, yeah.
Yeah.
The Hebrew approach is life in action, while the Hellenistic is more theoretical, more intellectual, perhaps more removed.
That distinction, the source argues it's profoundly relevant today, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Towards the end, it raises some pretty pointed criticisms for contemporary communities.
What kind of criticisms?
Well, it questions whether modern religious leaders and maybe communities in general might have drifted away from that original Hebrew approach, becoming detached from the urgent problems of the real world.
And it asks if followers maybe have developed a tendency towards a kind of blind faith, just following doctrines or leaders without really engaging critically with reality.
Exactly. It's a direct challenge for contemporary faith communities to look at how they're actually living out their beliefs.
A tough question.
Definitely. It even brings up Jesus' own sharp critiques, of the scribes and Pharisees, even his challenge to Peter to underscore how serious these pitfalls can be. Mm-hmm. It's basically asking, are we truly engaging with the world thoughtfully, critically? Or are we defaulting to something less demanding? Perhaps easier.
Wow. This deep dive has really taken us through a powerful and, at times challenging perspective, a view on salvation, suffering, community. It goes beyond just personal belief.
Mm-hmm. It emphasizes entering the reality of suffering, forming an identity forged by that shared experience.
Yeah.
And then actively working to solve problems with God.
So to sort of wrap up, at its core, this source argues for rediscovering that original Hebrewism, a culture built on the intense lived experiences of being the sojourner, the slave.
Right. Not something to forget, but the very foundation that calls a community to actively engage with and solve real-world problems alongside God.
And it poses that stark contrast, the Hebrew approach of life in action versus the Hellenistic approach of theory from a distance.
Suggesting maybe we've tilted too far towards the latter.
It certainly challenges us, you listening included, to look honestly at our own practices today. Are we truly engaging with the difficult realities around us, as this source suggests was the original mandate?
Or are we perhaps defaulting to a faith that avoids the messiness? Maybe mirroring the very critiques Jesus made centuries ago.
So what does this all mean for you? Ultimately, this deep dive asks us to consider salvation not just as a personal status you get through belief,
but as an ongoing journey, restoring a relationship with God through action.
Action rooted deeply in shared experience and a direct call to confront suffering in the world. So let's leave you with that powerful question the source itself seems to pose. It's built on this idea that truly entering difficult reality is the essential starting point for solving problems.
If that's true.
What challenging, maybe uncomfortable situation or problem in your own life or in the world around you might you currently be actively avoiding?